The timing is rather delicate, isn't it, considering all the headlines around the demotion of her brother Andrew. How do you think she'll handle any questions about that?
5 minutes ago, Princess Anne did what the palace had spent months preventing. She spoke not in defense of power, but in defense of restraint. And with that single intervention, the monarchy's most carefully managed winter secret cracked open, the silence that finally broke. The words did not arrive wrapped in ceremony or softened by tradition. They came without warning, delivered in a tone so controlled it felt almost surgical. Princess Anne broke her silence just minutes ago, and the effect inside Buckingham Palace was immediate, not because of what she said, but because she said it at all. Anne does not speak unless something has already gone too far, and everyone inside the royal system understands that rule without needing it explained. For weeks, the palace had insisted that Queen Camilla's sudden removal from ceremonial influence was procedural, necessary, clinical, a winter recalibration framed as modernization rather than punishment. Briefings repeated the exact phrases until they lost meaning. But Anne's words, quiet and deliberate, shattered that narrative in a matter of moments. She did not accuse anyone directly, yet she acknowledged something the institution works relentlessly to avoid admitting. Those recent actions, taken in the name of order, had crossed into cruelty. That single word changed everything. Cruelty is not a language the monarchy allows to exist within its own walls. Discipline, correction, protocol, and even sacrifice are accepted as the cost of survival. Cruelty implies excess. It suggests that the restraint failed. And most dangerously, it indicates that someone was treated not as a problem to be managed, but as a person to be diminished. Within minutes of Anne's confirmation, senior aides realized the palace no longer controlled the framing of Camilla's fall. Phones began ringing before the echo of her words had fully settled. Advisors moved quickly, but not with confidence. Legal teams reviewed previously released statements to search for vulnerabilities. Communications staff quietly abandoned drafts prepared under the assumption that silence would hold. It no longer would. Anne had spoken after the palace believed the matter was closed, and that timing alone signaled that something had shifted behind the scenes. What made the moment more unsettling was Anne's restraint. She did not raise her voice. She did not defend Camilla's authority or contest the king's decision. Instead, she addressed proportionality. She spoke of a lost balance, of correction becoming harsher once dignity was removed from the process. Those listening understood immediately that this was not a personal disagreement. It was a warning delivered from the deepest layer of institutional conscience. Princess Anne is not known for emotional interventions. She has spent her life enforcing rules rather than questioning them. For her to suggest that the palace had mishandled Camilla meant the issue was no longer about power, but about precedent. How the monarchy treats someone once their usefulness ends matters more than any single decision. Anne understood that if the public accepted this treatment as usual, the crown's claim to moral authority would fracture quietly but permanently. Inside the palace, the mood shifted from control to containment. The removal of Camilla had already unsettled staff, but Anne's intervention introduced something far more dangerous than sympathy. It introduced doubt. Doubt about whether the line between necessity and punishment had been deliberately blurred. Doubt about whether the winter recalibration was, in fact, an exercise in institutional cruelty disguised as order. This was not the first time Anne had disagreed with how a senior royal was handled, but it was the first time she allowed that disagreement to surface publicly, even in measured form. Those closest to her recognized the significance immediately. Anne had tolerated months of silence, months of watching Camilla isolated, stripped of influence piece by piece, while the palace insisted it was all unavoidable. Something had finally forced her hand. That something was not sentiment. Anne does not act out of nostalgia or personal attachment. What compelled her was the realization that the palace had begun to confuse decisiveness with humiliation, that the process meant to stabilize the monarchy had instead revealed a willingness to discard one of its own without regard for the consequences. And Anne, more than anyone, understands how quickly such patterns repeat once normalized. The timing of her words matters as much as their content. This intervention did not come during the decision, when objections could have been framed as internal disagreement. It came after the announcement, after the machinery had moved on, after the palace believed it had closed the chapter. Anne deliberately reopened it, knowing full well the disruption it would cause. That choice alone suggests she thought the alternative was worse. Within minutes, journalists who had spent weeks defending the procedural narrative began reassessing their assumptions. Royal correspondents recognized Anne's language as code, the kind used only when internal alarms have already sounded. If Anne was acknowledging cruelty now, it meant she had already raised concerns privately and been overruled. Speaking publicly was not her first move. It was her last. And that is what makes this moment so volatile. Princess Anne did not break the silence to protect Camilla's position. She broke it to protect the institution from itself. She understood that allowing the narrative to stand unchallenged would quietly redefine how the monarchy treats those who fall out of favor. Not with dignity, not with restraint, but with cold efficiency masquerading as order. This was never about whether Camilla should retain influence. That decision had already been made. This was about how the monarchy chose to execute it, and whether it had crossed a line it could not afford to normalize. Anne's words, measured and precise, forced the palace into an uncomfortable position. Either acknowledge that something went wrong, or accept that cruelty has become part of its operating language. And once that door opens, it does not close easily. What the palace refused to say. For months, the palace relied on silence as its primary defense. Not the dignified silence of tradition, but the calculated quiet that follows an uncomfortable decision once those in power believe the public will eventually look away. Briefings were issued with deliberate vagueness. Language was scrubbed clean of emotion. Every reference to Camilla's withdrawal was framed as administrative, procedural, and inevitable. The message was consistent and repeated often enough to feel rehearsed rather than truthful. Behind closed doors, however, the story was far less settled. Senior aides understood early on that Camilla's removal would provoke discomfort, not because of her popularity, but because of the speed and severity with which her influence was stripped. Influence in the monarchy is rarely removed all at once. It erodes quietly, softened by time, offset by symbolic gestures. What happened instead was abrupt, cold, and visibly isolating. And that is what the palace refused to acknowledge. From the moment the decision was finalized, an internal directive went out discouraging discussion. Staff were advised to refer all inquiries to the appropriate authority. Longtime aides who had worked closely with Camilla were reassigned or quietly sidelined. Meetings that once included her perspective suddenly proceeded without notice. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Camilla was no longer part of the conversation, and acknowledging the manner of her removal was considered disloyal. This internal freeze did not sit comfortably with everyone. Princess Anne was not alone in noticing the shift, but she was one of the few with the authority to challenge it. Others felt it, sensed it, but remained silent. They understood the unspoken rule. Once a decision is framed as necessary for stability, questioning its execution becomes dangerous. Silence in that context is not neutrality, it is survival. What the palace refused to say publicly was that there had been disagreement, not over whether Camilla's role should change, but over how it should be done. Several advisors had warned that removing her influence too quickly would read as punitive, especially to older audiences who had watched her endure decades of scrutiny. Those warnings were logged, acknowledged, and ultimately dismissed. Efficiency won over optics. Finality won over dignity. The refusal to speak openly created its own pressure. Rumors filled the void left by official restraint. Staff whispers leaked through indirect channels. Journalists began to notice the absence of familiar names from guest lists and planning documents. The more the palace insisted nothing was wrong, the more obvious it became that something had been mishandled. Silence, rather than containing the story, began to distort it. Anne watched this unfold with growing unease. She had spent her life defending the monarchy's right to discipline itself without external interference. But discipline, in her view, must be anchored in proportion. What disturbed her was not Camilla's loss of authority, but the deliberate erasure that followed. No transitional role, no public acknowledgement of service, no soft landing. The palace acted as if Camilla's presence had been a temporary inconvenience rather than a defining feature of the reign's early years. The internal justification was always the same. Stability required clarity. The crown could not afford ambiguity. But Anne understood that clarity does not require cruelty. You can end a role without diminishing the person who held it. The palace's refusal to say that distinction aloud revealed a more profound discomfort. Admitting miscalculation would suggest fallibility, and fallibility is something institutions fear more than criticism. Pressure mounted quietly. Foreign correspondents began asking why Camilla's absence felt so complete. Longtime royal watchers noticed the absence of the usual farewell rituals that accompany significant transitions. Even those who believed the decision itself was justified began questioning its execution. The palace responded by tightening its language further, reducing explanations instead of expanding them. It was a gamble that silence would outlast curiosity. What forced Anne's hand was the realization that silence had become complicity. By refusing to acknowledge the human cost of the decision, the palace was allowing a narrative to solidify. A narrative in which authority could be removed without accountability, in which service could be erased without reflection. Anne understood that once such a precedent is set, it does not remain isolated, it becomes a template. Her private objections had already been raised. She had questioned the pace, the tone, and the lack of transitional care. Each time she was met with assurances that the matter was settled, that reopening it would invite instability. But Anne also understood another truth. Stability achieved through fear or humiliation is temporary. It fractures from within, quietly at first, then all at once. The palace refused to say that Camilla's treatment had unsettled staff. It declined to say that morale had dipped. It declined to say that some advisors worried about how future spouses, future consorts, future senior figures would interpret this moment. Anne said none of this explicitly, but her acknowledgement of cruelty implied it all. It signaled that the silence was no longer sustainable. By breaking her silence, Anne forced the institution to confront what it had avoided. Those decisions made in the name of survival still require moral coherence. That efficiency without empathy corrodes trust, and that the monarchy's greatest threat is not scandal, but the slow normalization of coldness disguised as order. What the palace refused to say, Anne finally did, and in doing so, she exposed the cost of silence itself. Camilla's winter descent. Camilla's descent did not begin with an announcement. It started with omission, the quiet kind that only those accustomed to palace rhythms notice. Invitations that once arrived without effort stopped appearing. Briefings she had routinely reviewed were redirected elsewhere. Meetings continued, but her name was no longer attached to the agenda. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational, just a gradual thinning of presence that signaled something fundamental had shifted. At first, Camilla interpreted the change as temporary. The monarchy had entered a demanding season, and Charles was under visible strain. She believed her withdrawal was tactical, a way to reduce friction while larger institutional pressures were managed. She had lived through worse periods of isolation and assumed this was another chapter requiring patience. But as the days shortened and winter tightened its grip, the pattern hardened into something unmistakable. Her access to decision-making narrowed rapidly. Advisors she had relied on for years began deferring conversations or offering vague reassurances rather than providing clarity. When she questioned altered ceremonial drafts, she was told they were under review. When she asked about upcoming engagements, responses came late, stripped of detail. The warmth that once accompanied her role was replaced by formality so rigid it bordered on hostility. What made the descent cruel was not the loss of power itself, but the manner in which it was executed. Camilla was not eased out. She was cut off. Influence was not gradually reassigned. It was removed in blocks. One day she was consulted. The next she was informed. Then, without warning, she was neither. The palace framed this as efficiency, but to those watching closely it looked like erasure. Isolation followed quickly. Staff accustomed to checking in began avoiding her corridor altogether. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Familiar faces offered polite nods instead of engagement. It was not that people had turned against her personally. It was that fear had entered the system. Once someone is marked as diminished, proximity becomes risk, and in the monarchy, risk is avoided at all costs. Camilla's attempts to regain her footing only deepened the problem. Each question was interpreted as resistance. Each request for explanation was logged as interference. The very traits that once defined her usefulness, attentiveness, involvement, and strategic thinking were now recast as overreach. The rules had changed, but no one told her when or how. A framework was judging her. She was no longer allowed to see. The emotional toll became impossible to hide. Those who encountered her during this period described a woman oscillating between composure and disbelief. She did not lash out. She did not demand loyalty. Instead, she withdrew into herself, trying to understand how decades of service could dissolve so quickly into silence. Her confidence, once steady, began to fracture under the weight of unanswered questions. What the palace underestimated was how visible this descent would become. While official narratives insisted on a calm transition, Camilla's absence was conspicuous. Public appearances lacked her stabilizing presence. Ceremonial moments felt oddly hollow. Observers noticed the difference even if they could not name it. Something was missing, and the palace did not explain the procedural language. The cruelty lay in the refusal to acknowledge her humanity during the process. There was no public gratitude, no recognition of the role she played during the monarchy's most delicate transition. No acknowledgement that her contributions, however contested, had shaped the early years of the reign. Instead, the palace treated her influence as a malfunction to be corrected rather than a chapter to be closed with care. Privately, Camilla felt the shift acutely. The palace had always been a place of negotiation and compromise, but this was something else entirely. This was exclusion by design, a signal that her presence was no longer just unnecessary, but inconvenient. Each day, without explanation, reinforced the message that she was being written out of the institutional story altogether. The coldness intensified as winter deepened. Decisions were finalized without her knowledge. Public schedules were released without reference to her. Even symbolic gestures, the quiet reassurances institutions often offer to soften transitions, were absent. It was as if the palace feared that any acknowledgement of her past influence might complicate the narrative of control it was trying to project. This is where Princess Anne's concern sharpened into alarm. Anne understood removal, she understood discipline, but she also understood proportion. Watching Camilla's descent, she recognized a pattern she had seen before when institutions choose expediency over fairness, when silence becomes a tool not just to manage perception, but to diminish a person until their absence feels natural. Camilla's winter descent was not loud. It was not scandalous. It was methodical. And that, in Anne's view, made it far more dangerous. Because methodical cruelty can be justified, defended, and repeated without anyone ever naming it as such, it creates a precedent in which service offers no protection once its usefulness ends. By the time the palace issued its final bulletin, Camilla had already been living in a kind of internal exile. The announcement did not shock her as much as it confirmed what she had already felt. The silence had been the warning. The erasure had been the process. And the finality, when it came, was simply the last step in a descent that had been carefully engineered long before the public ever noticed. This was not just Camilla's fall. It was a lesson unfolding in real time about how power withdraws its favor, and Princess Anne, watching it happen, understood that if this treatment were allowed to stand without challenge, it would not be the last winter descent the monarchy would witness. Anne versus the machine. Princess Anne did not move quickly. She never does. Her resistance did not begin with confrontation or raised voices, but with observation. She watched the machinery turn, listened to the language used in briefings, and noted the way Camilla's name gradually disappeared from documents that once required her sign-off. Anne understands systems better than almost anyone alive, and she knew that when erasure happens quietly, it is rarely accidental. At first, Anne raised her concerns privately. She asked questions framed in the language the palace respects most: process, precedent, proportion. She wanted to know why transitional safeguards had been skipped, why public acknowledgement had been avoided, why the withdrawal of influence had been executed with such abruptness. Each time she was given the same answer: stability required clarity. Delay would invite speculation. The decision was final, and reopening it would weaken the crown. Anne did not accept that reasoning easily, but she did not challenge it publicly either. She understood the dangers of visible dissent within the family, especially during a fragile winter season. Instead, she monitored how the decision was being implemented, and what she saw troubled her deeply. The removal of Camilla's authority had evolved into something harsher, something that felt less like governance and more like punishment administered through neglect. What alarmed Anne most was the lack of institutional restraint. The machine did not slow once the decision was made. It accelerated. Committees moved faster. Advisors acted with sharper certainty. Silence was enforced not by orders but by fear. People stopped asking questions because they understood what happened to those who did. The system, once designed to protect the monarchy from chaos, had begun protecting itself from scrutiny. Anne had seen this pattern before, not in palaces but in other institutions she had encountered through decades of public service. When systems prioritize efficiency above all else, compassion becomes collateral damage. And Anne, who had always believed discipline was meaningless without fairness, felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This was no longer about Camilla. It was about how power behaved once unchecked. The moment Anne truly clashed with the machine came during a late briefing where a senior advisor referred to Camilla's situation as resolved. The word struck Anne sharply. Resolved suggested closure, acceptance, and balance. None of those conditions existed. Camilla was isolated, staff morale was strained, and the palace was pretending the outcome was orderly simply because it was quiet. Anne interrupted the briefing, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. She reminded the room that resolution without accountability is not resolution at all, that removing influence does not require stripping dignity, and that the monarchy's strength has always rested on the belief that it corrects itself with restraint, not cruelty. The room fell silent, not because Anne was wrong, but because no one else was prepared to say what she had just articulated. From that moment on, Anne understood she was no longer debating a decision. She was confronting a system determined to protect itself from admitting excess. Advisors did not argue with her openly. They acknowledged her points, then continued as before. The machine absorbed her objections without changing course. That was when Anne realized private resistance had reached its limit. Anne's loyalty to the crown has never been blind. It has always been conditional on the crown's willingness to live up to its own standards. Watching the machine operate with such cold precision, she recognized a dangerous drift. When power stops questioning itself, it becomes brittle, and brittle institutions break, not from outside pressure, but from internal corrosion. Her decision to speak was not impulsive. It was calculated and reluctant. Anne knew that breaking the silence would unsettle the palace, invite scrutiny, and complicate an already fragile narrative. But she also knew that allowing the machine to normalize this behavior would cost the monarchy far more in the long run. Silence, in this case, was no longer neutral, it was an endorsement. By the time Anne spoke publicly, she had exhausted every internal avenue. Her words were measured because they needed to be. She did not seek to dismantle the decision, only to expose how it had been carried out. In doing so, she placed herself squarely against the institution's momentum, not as a rebel, but as a guardian, reminding the crown of its own values. Anne versus the machine was never a battle for power. It was a confrontation between conscience and efficiency, and in choosing to speak, Anne made clear that when those two collide, the monarchy's survival depends on which one is allowed to prevail. The family fracture no one wanted. The fracture did not announce itself with shouting or dramatic exits. It settled quietly into the family, like cold seeping through stone walls that had endured centuries of storms. Everyone felt it, but no one named it aloud. The removal of Camilla's influence had already altered the institutional balance. Princess Anne's intervention now altered the emotional one, exposing fault lines the family had worked hard to keep buried beneath duty and restraint. For King Charles, the fracture was deeply personal. He had authorized the decision, believing it was the least damaging option available, a necessary sacrifice to stabilize the monarchy during a fragile season. Yet hearing Anne's words forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth, that in trying to protect the institution, he may have allowed it to wound someone he loved more harshly than intended. Charles is not blind to consequences, but he has always struggled with the cost of decisiveness. Privately, those close to the king described a man pulled inward by doubt. He did not dispute the need for boundaries. He did not regret restoring clarity to ceremonial order. What unsettled him was the realization that control had overtaken compassion somewhere along the way. The monarchy demands that its leaders endure loneliness, but this was a different kind of isolation. It was the loneliness of realizing that authority does not shield you from moral responsibility. Prince William absorbed the moment differently. Where Charles felt grief, William felt pressure. As heir, he understood that Anne's words would not simply fade. They would shape how future decisions were interpreted, including those he would one day make himself. William had supported the recalibration out of necessity, not malice, but Anne's intervention forced him to confront how easily necessity can slide into severity if left unchecked. William's restraint during this period was deliberate. He did not contradict Anne publicly, nor did he amplify her message. Instead, he oversaw the reaction, assessing how the institution responded when challenged from within. He understood that leadership is not measured only by decisions, but by how an institution responds when its own conscience speaks back. And what he saw was unsettling. The fracture extended beyond the principle. Family gatherings grew more formal. Conversations skirted the issue without addressing it directly. The unspoken question hovered in every room. Had the monarchy gone too far in the name of order? No one wanted to answer it because the answer threatened to destabilize the fragile peace they were trying to maintain. What made the fracture particularly dangerous was its subtlety. There were no sides declared, no alliances announced. Instead, there was a quiet recalibration of trust. Anne's willingness to speak had altered how others viewed silence. What had once been interpreted as loyalty now risked being seen as avoidance. The family, bound by shared history and shared burden, found itself navigating a moral gray space with no clear resolution. Camilla, though largely absent from these discussions, remained the silent center of the fracture. Her treatment had become the reference point for a more profound unease about how the monarchy manages decline, not just of power, but of favor. Even those who believed the decision was correct struggled with the way it had been carried out. The family could feel the weight of that discomfort, even if they never named it. Charles attempted to steady the situation by narrowing focus, returning attention to schedules, engagements, and public duty. But duty does not erase doubt, it only delays its reckoning. Anne's words lingered precisely because they were measured, not accusatory. They invited reflection rather than outrage, which made them harder to dismiss. This was the family fracture no one wanted because it had no villain and no straightforward fix. It was born not of betrayal but of exhaustion, of a system pushed to act quickly, of people forced to choose between stability and empathy, and of an institution struggling to remember that its strength has always come from balancing both. The monarchy has survived wars, abdications, and scandals because it learned how to absorb fractures without collapsing. But every fracture leaves a mark, and this one, quiet and unresolved, would shape how future decisions are made long after the winter that brought it to light had passed. After the silence. After Princess Anne spoke, the palace did not respond immediately. It could not. Silence, once a shield, had become the subject itself. Advisors understood that any reaction, whether defensive or conciliatory, risked validating Anne's intervention in ways the institution could not fully control. So the monarchy did what it has always done when confronted with an uncomfortable truth. It paused. That pause marked a subtle but significant shift. The machinery slowed. Briefings grew more careful. Language once rigid softened almost imperceptibly. No statements were retracted, no apologies issued, but the tone changed. It was an acknowledgement without admission, a recalibration designed to restore equilibrium without reopening wounds the palace feared would deepen if examined too closely. Camilla remained absent from public life, but the manner of her absence began to evolve. Where silence had once felt punitive, it now carried a different weight. Less erasure, more distance. The distinction mattered, even if it was never articulated. Those watching closely understood that Anne's words had forced a correction, not of outcome, but of approach. Within the family, the effects were quieter still. Conversations resumed with more caution. Decisions were weighed with an added awareness of how they might be remembered, not just justified. Anne's intervention had not undone what was done, but it had reintroduced conscience into a process that had drifted toward automation. In institutions, that is often the most difficult correction to make. The public reaction reflected the complexity of the moment. Some praised Anne's integrity, seeing her as a rare voice of moral clarity within a system that too often hides behind procedure. Others viewed her comments as unnecessary, even destabilizing. But what mattered most was not the division. It was the fact that the question had been asked at all. Had the monarchy crossed a line? And if so, how would it ensure it did not happen again? For King Charles, the aftermath carried a quiet resolve. He did not revisit the decision, but he absorbed its lessons. Authority, he understood, must always be paired with reflection. For William, the moment served as a reminder that the future of the crown would depend not just on strength, but on restraint, especially when dealing with those closest to its center. Anne returned to her duties without fanfare. She did not elaborate on her words or seek validation for them. Her role was complete. She had spoken when silence threatened to become precedent, and then she stepped back, trusting the institution to correct itself as it always claims it can. What remains now is not scandal, but memory. The memory of a winter when efficiency edged too close to cruelty, and one voice, disciplined and reluctant, refused to let that distinction disappear. The monarchy will move forward, as it always does. But it will do so carrying the imprint of this moment, a reminder that stability built without humanity is not stability at all. As this chapter settles into history, one truth remains difficult to ignore. Power survives not by silence alone, but by the courage to question itself. Princess Anne's words did not rewrite the past, but they may yet shape what comes next. If this story made you pause, reflect, or reconsider what leadership truly demands, stay with us. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and join the conversation that refuses to fade quietly.